But it turned out that we are not powerless at all. But in order to figure it out, we had actually had to risk helping Ukraine with weaponry. But the problem is that humanitarian assistance is much, much more morally straightforward than military assistance. It's not for nothing that some countries have actually laws against sending their weaponry to conflict zones. There is this evident danger that this would fuel the war rather than help the victims of aggression.
And now to set our intention for this time together. Attention must be paid. This iconic phrase from the great American play Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller calls us to attend to each other for no other reason than because we are human, especially when members of our human family have a terrible thing happen to them. As it turns out, the entire human family and all our cousins in the animal and plant kingdoms are having a terrible thing happen to us. Actually, many terrible things on every continent and in the seas that embrace us all. Here at One Mountain, Many Paths, we call this the meta-crisis. Today, I invite each and every one of us to pay attention to it all, no matter how painful it might be to do so. Let our attention be not only on the crisis, though, but on the underlying cause of that crisis, the global intimacy disorder, which underlies the root of our meta-crisis. In this moment of communion, let us bring forth our deepest presence, opening our hearts wide to embark on a sacred journey of awakening, both as individuals and as community. Guided by the radiant light of divine consciousness, let us, hand in hand, fearlessly face both the meta-crisis and the intimacy disorder at its roots, so that we may find ever deeper intimacy, not only with each other, but with all of creation and with that animating eros that continues to give birth in each moment and to each moment. As we watch, often in horror, the intricate tapestry of our world, we witness manifestations of this global intimacy disorder, a dance of rivalrous conflicts and fragile systems. Yet, let's understand that these manifestations are not the root cause of our meta-crisis. They are instead reflections of the underlying disconnection we endure. We find ourselves torn, both horrified by the unfolding crises on so many fronts, yet continuing to yearn for ever deepening connection with the all that is. So painful can this push-pull be that we mask our yearning by turning away in 1,000 different ways, averting our eyes, numbing our senses, distracting ourselves with less weighty matters. And yet, our yearning for the healing of our rift in intimacy remains in our hearts. Attention must be paid. So today, I invite all of us in this community to pay attention, to put down our distractions, awaken our senses, and look straight into the face of the world, which is the hidden face of the divine, and see not only the crisis and not only the intimacy disorder that continues to threaten not only the death of humanity, but also the death of our humanity, but to see our unique roles, both individual and communal, in the healing of that disorder. This may not be easy. In this moment in human history, at a level that we have never before seen, attention is a commodity, a good to be monetized. Commercial and political interests see our attention as something to be bought, sold, and manipulated using devices of unimaginable power that can seem at times beyond our capacity to resist. Algorithms crafted by the brightest minds among us choreograph a tap dance on our conscious and unconscious minds, all to drive our attention where gain can be had. Easy or not, attention must be paid. With the power of our conscious intention to pay attention, let us today, here and now, affirm our dedication to unraveling the threads of disconnection and reweaving the tapestry of authentic intimacy that transcends boundaries, uniting us in our shared humanity. Let us join together in a unique self-symphony to ignite the flame of awareness, sparking a revolution of love to heal our global intimacy disorder. Let us intend to listen deeply as our guest speaker, Elena, opens her heart to us. Let us intend to open our hearts to Elena and to each other and experience the radical vulnerability and radical aliveness that is the natural byproduct of the placing of our attention on the truth of what is unfolding at this critical moment. Let us open ourselves so radically with our attention that we gasp in awe at who each of us is and who each of us is called to be and become. Attention must be paid. Let us set aside our masks, which may have served us in other times in our lives, but now only serve to contribute to the intimacy disorder, driving us ever closer to falling over the brink on which we teeter already. Let us tear down our walls, open our arms, and embrace each other in the face of these global catastrophes, even as voices within and around us cry out for us to shut down, close our eyes and our hearts, and listen only to the voices that soothe us with the pablum of what we want to hear. Let us intend to join hands, link arms, and with hearts open, our eyes clear, our ears attuned, and our minds discerning into the challenges of our times, and walk resolutely to give our unique gifts to the cause of love and holy intimacy. Attention must be paid. Finally, today I call forth our intention to place both our attention on both the near and far, on our neighbors next door and on distant continents. Like the meta-crisis and the global intimacy disorder, the field of value knows no borders, has no national boundaries. Standing at this crossroads in the history of our species and the history of life itself, we cannot luxuriate in the false notion that only the proximal issues matter. No, instead, we must broaden our horizons so far that we no longer see horizons, so that we instead see only one global family of beings for whom we must each care. Attention must be paid. In that spirit of attention, let us listen carefully to today's code. And I turn it over to you, my brother David.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. Attention must be paid. And if you've been paying attention, which I'm sure you have, you'll probably notice that behind me is a person that's been well known as really cultivating that attention, right? The Buddha. And as Christina mentioned earlier, and if you saw, Christine was also in this space where the same Buddha was behind me, and so was Krista. It's because we're all in the same place together. So where are we? Christina mentioned earlier, we are actually all in Vermont doing what Dr. Tom Goddard was describing just a few minutes ago, of responding to this global intimacy disorder by weaving together a shared grammar of value, right? And so I just want to point out that there's something so beautiful happening here, that you're here with us. You're actually participating with us, because we have, a rabbi in a Zen monastery talking about the future of humanity, right? And we're all here from so many different places, weaving together global intimacy. So welcome as you're part of this process. And as we go into Dr. Maslova-Levin's sense-making, this code frames everything that we're doing here, right? And what she's about to give such a holy and deep understanding about. So here's this week's evolutionary love code. The root cause of the meta-crisis is the global intimacy disorder. The rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics that drive society and the fragile systems it generates are not the root cause of the meta crisis. They're rather expressions of the global intimacy disorder. The root cause of the global intimacy disorder is the collapse of value. So much of humanity experiences itself as living outside of the field of value. For indeed, we have forgotten that the only place where we can ever exist is inside the field of value. To restore global intimacy is to open our eyes personally and collectively to the wondrous truth that every move we make and every breath we take is on the inside of the field of value. This means that we must stand for value not only in our local contexts, but in our global contexts. In 2023, that means standing with Ukraine. It's with great honor and pleasure that I hand my word over to you, Dr. Maslova-Levin.
So, hello everyone, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Tom, for this wonderful intention setting, and I invite you to pay attention, not to me, but to the story. And David, thank you for the code. And just to start and to, frame this, my presence here. So I know Marc says all the time that he's not a guru, but I am like the whole next level of not being a guru. I'm like really not a guru and not a rabbi. So excuse me if I will be not as inspiring and convincing as Marc usually is. Still, another thing, just to locate myself in this whole story. So I was born in Russia, but the family lineage with which I mostly connect myself spiritually and intellectually comes from Ukraine. And I've been living in America, in California, for most of my adult life, essentially for the whole of 21st century, and before that in Germany and the Netherlands for a time. So I kind of find myself in the intersections between all participants, which is not to imply any moral equivalence between them. And from this point, what I am asking myself today, as we are gathering here to tell this new story, is what response or responses to this war would or should emerge or would be most aligned with the new story of value rooted in the first principles and first values. And more than that, why have we been silent on this topic for such a long time? Because after all, as I said, we are gathering here to articulate this new story of value as a response to the global crisis of intimacy. And this is the highest and most urgent moral imperative of our time. That's what we said. But that's what's puzzling for me. Like, at this moment, the war in Ukraine is one of the most significant, if not the most significant and potentially dangerous eruptions of this crisis. But after the initial set of conversations in the first month of the war, we here have been silent on this topic. Yes, we have published a book based on this first month of teachings, but even about that, Marc once said something to the effect that this book is not really about Ukraine, but about value. Or in other words, we are not interested in Ukraine per se, we are just using Ukraine to clarify the new story of value. Sounded to me a bit like while they are dying for our values, we are using it as a good occasion to critique the postmodern deconstruction of value. And for me, I must admit, it is actually very much about Ukraine. And if the new story turns out to be powerless in the face of this particular manifestation of the meta crisis, if it cannot help us to clarify our response when faced with its real life mess and horror and outrageous pain and mutual hate, what does it really say about the claimed effectiveness of the story as a response to the meta-crisis? But as Marc foresaw in the very beginning, the public attention gradually dwindled away to an extent, including us here. And as the center of our collective response shifted towards, as it were, institutional response, NATO, the US administration, the European Commission, the moral equivalence narratives, which Marc criticized initially, gained more strength. And in a sense, they occupied the empty space of the much needed new story rooted in the first values and first principles. And the result is a moral confusion, which quite literally kills Ukrainians, like right now in this very moment and every day of the last 15 months. And so to truly connect to what is happening, I invite you, perhaps paradoxically, to contemplate with me this painting, the famous painting by Pablo Picasso, Guernica. And this is one of the most powerful paintings I have ever seen. And, I first actually seen it in real life, in its like larger than life size, just recently in 2019, just before the pandemic. And it was a very strange experience because my husband, Eugene, he stood there and he kept telling me that it is a moral obligation of every human being to actually experience it. And for me, it was so terrible. The experience was so overwhelming, so awful, like it's like really like being there, that I actually thought, no, it's not mine. Why should I experience that? Like Spain, why should that? I have enough. That's not mine. And I actually left. And in this deep place where my personal story actually connects with the cosmic story, it sometimes feels like, the universe is telling me you didn't want to experience it in art. Now, here you go, experience it in real life. And there is this story about Picasso, about how someone, like German guy, asked Picasso, did you do that? And Picasso answered, no, you did. That's how I feel now, we did, right? There is a contemporary Russian poet, Maria Stepanova, who now lives in Germany, who wrote these two lines: while we were sleeping, we were bombing Kharkiv. And that's how I feel, every morning, wake up, read the news. As a Russian, while we were sleeping, whom have I killed? As an American, while I was sleeping, whom have I failed to protect? So we did it. And that's because who else, as Marc asks, who else could have done it? We did it. And that's the space from which I ask you to pay your attention. Remember a couple of weeks ago, Marc asked us to imagine ourselves in the future when the existential risk and catastrophic risk, all we have been talking about, is actually already unfolding. But we are allowed to go back into this time and act differently. And all I could think about this in response is that it is already happening, complete with not only with the existential risk, but with the ongoing death of our humanity, the complete devolution and degradation in humanity in Russia. But it kind of began from an unexpected direction. And so far, we are more or less far from the epicenter, most of us. And so we turn away, we don't look up, as it were. And in my imagination, I did travel back in time in search of that fork on the road where I could have acted differently for this not to happen, through us, you know, me and my husband and son leaving Russia in 1996 and kind of deciding that it's not our business. And then 1994, when Bill Clinton pressured Ukraine to transfer its nuclear arsenal to Russia, by the way, in exchange for security guarantees. And he recently admitted that that was a huge mistake. And then the barricades of 1991, where we participated in the dismantling of the Soviet Union to the best of our efforts, and hoped that we did it peacefully, but now look at it. And further back still, and further back, and further back, and I abandoned my journey somewhere early in the Middle Ages, but without clear answers. In other words, to me, this is it. This violent eruption of the global intimacy crisis, the complete breakdown of global systems of security. But we are silent, so we kind of don't recognize it as such here. And one reason why, I think, is because here we tend to focus on essential new challenges, exponential technologies, artificial intelligence, rogue non-state actors with access to weapons of mass destruction. We focus on the future, on the new, but instead the crisis erupted from the past, from the old, from the outdated. And indeed, in a sense, it is the war of the past against the future. You know, as the Soviet Union collapsed in the beginning of the 90s, it was so tempting to think that this was the end of history, that the past is laid to rest, but this is not quite the case. So as we were looking at artificial intelligence as the main danger to our humanity, instead we see it undermined and devolving by means of quite old-fashioned propaganda and corruption. And you know, something tells me that if the AI had somehow been complicit in this war, we would have spent much more time talking about it here. And as we were worrying about non-state rogue actors possessing nuclear weapons, we kind of missed a state actor in possession of the second largest or even largest nuclear arsenal going rogue and completely losing touch with reality and creating a very, very real existential risk. And as we were worrying about global climate change, an ecological or humanitarian catastrophe created simply for the short-term military goals, the explosion of the Kakhovka Dam, remained almost unnoticed, even as its ecological and most likely epidemiological consequences are going to touch most of Europe rather sooner than later. And in fact, this incredibly anti-climatic public reaction to this latest crime, including the unusually slow response from all international aid organizations and our silence here, is what made me realize the dangers of our silence and the power of this alternative confusing narrative. And this is which Marc and I agreed to set up this special One Mountain. This, our kind of lack of appropriate reaction to this is as though everyone has by now like normalized the Ukrainian suffering and turned away. New day, new Ukrainian suffering, agriculture destroyed. There is no drinking water. Like at some point areas there is flood. The areas upward on the river there is no drinking water. And we are not talking about it. And our lack of response actually paved the way to the next catastrophe because the nuclear station nearby is already prepared to be exploded by Russians for no good reason, certainly. And it is quite symbolic, I think, that this Novokakhovka reservoir that was dried up because of this catastrophe, because of this flood, actually revealed the skulls and military equipment from World War II. So I'm showing you this photograph. It's like, so here we go. The past is here, just barely covered by the water. And so another danger of the past is the uncanny way in which it prevents us to actually see the new and the unexpected. And the fact is that our very biology leads us to interpret everything in terms of past experiences, past patterns, and it takes a special discipline to partly at least counteract this inbuilt tendency. And in many ways, the collective memories and traumas of World War II still shape our perception of this new war. I noticed, for example, that Marc almost never mentions Ukraine without mentioning Nazism in some form. And it was completely inexplicable to me until he told me recently that he grew up in the story of Ukraine being completely evil as a child because of the Ukrainian collaboration with Germans during the Holocaust. And although he immediately said that we cannot judge today's Ukrainians because of this past, still these stories live in us, these memories live in us. But the past is actually much richer than that. We don't know a lot about it. So yes, there were Ukrainian collaborators in the Holocaust, as in almost any country under the German occupation. Yet Ukraine also holds a decent fourth place in the list of the righteous of the nations maintained by Israel, that is, those who risked or sacrificed their lives to save Jews from Germans. And more than that, at that time, there used to be no clear distinction between Russia and the Soviet Union in the Western mind. And so it sometimes seems that Russia, but not Ukraine, suffered from the German invasion and participated in the defeat of Hitler, even though half of the officers of the Soviet army were actually Ukrainians. And Ukraine suffered more than Russia from this war because it was fully occupied. For most Americans and probably Europeans too, till very recently, Ukraine was kind of non-existent or was tarnished by these memories of World War II. And this cannot help but play out in one way or another in our collective perception of Ukraine. And so to counteract this to some extent, I want to show you, I want to show you just a very, very, very short video. And this is an incredible, incredible moment of a cosmocentric intimacy. And this is a video about a guy saving a cat during the flood, the recent flood on the river Dnipro. And the cat sees the boat and it jumps to swim towards the boat to be saved. And as it is saved, the people who are actually sitting on the roofs nearby, still very much in danger, they burst into applause. So here is this video. Just look at it.
Це наш сотик. Може, дивись, який він. Спокійний віддяга.
So I just, that at the end, someone cries from, like, we don't see. This is ours. This is our kitty, someone cries. And this guy, he kind of smiles in this, looks at us and smiles in this very strange way. And he says, ours, ours. And you kind of feel that it's clear that the words, our cat, their cat, they don't mean anything anymore. So this is the Ukraine I want you to think about as I'm talking. So what to really, and I ask you to see this little video as our video code for today. So now let's just go deeper, as Marc says, like let's go deep for a minute. So let me remind you of the key dimensions of Marx's initial response to the war in that moment of intuitive moral clarity in response to the violation of value. The first point was to help Ukraine in any way we can. The second was to see things clearly, so sense-making and clarified perception, not splitting anything off, hence no demonization or dehumanization of Putin and Russia, yet not taking the easy road of moral equivalence either. And it also includes listening to everyone and having your facts actually right. And the third and key point was keep telling and refining the new story of value as the most effective response to the global meta crisis. Excuse me. But when he talked about helping Ukraine in any way we can, this help was implicitly meant to be humanitarian, like refugees, medical assistance, donations, things like that. And explicit was the assumption of our powerlessness in the face of Putin's nuclear blackmail. And that's literally what he said, we are powerless, which kind of plays on our new story of power, right? So in spite of Ukrainian heroism, he actually saw no way that Ukraine can win. But it turned out that we are not powerless at all. In order to figure it out, we had actually had to risk helping Ukraine with weaponry. But the problem is that humanitarian assistance is much, much more morally straightforward than military assistance. It's not for nothing that some countries have actually laws against sending their weaponry to conflict zones. There is this evident danger that this would fuel the war rather than help the victims of aggression. And the only way Marc foresaw of possibly eventually helping militarily is some sort of the future world army, an overwhelmingly powerful army accepted by every country as a force for peace and capable of defending any country. And yet, he said, this can happen only on the basis of universal grammar of value as a context for our diversity. In other words, the only thing we can do now is keep working on the universal grammar, which is kind of what we did. But the problem is that Ukraine is fighting and bleeding now, and Russia is devolving to unimaginable levels of degradation and oppression now. And for all their faults, the closest things we have to this future world army is NATO, and more generally the alliance of Western military powers, and the US, who, for better or for worse, carries the heavy burden of the leader of the free world, and provide the main source of NATO's shared resources. Talking about this notion of story in the recent weeks, Marc actually invoked Tolkien's trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. And in that story, if you remember, neither of the military powers Gandalf did his best to unite against Mordor, neither of them were perfect, very far from it. But it was not a good reason not to join the alliance against the rising darkness. And yet, of course, for many of us, supporting NATO is a much less morally clear choice than supporting the universal grammar of value and some ideal future army of Omar, which would probably not even be needed by that time. But the thing is, NATO was created as a defense alliance for this exact purpose, for this exact occasion, defense against Russia, more or less, because alone every single European country is weaker militarily than Russia. And as a defensive alliance, they are stronger. Except right now, Ukraine is fighting this battle alone for everyone, while we are engaging in moral negotiations about whether to give it powerful enough weapons to actually win, and whether it deserves to be accepted to NATO. Think about it. The negotiations about whether or not to give them the fighter jets have been going on like forever. And now it seems to have been finally decided that this can be done. It will just take some more and more time. And so now they were forced to start their counteroffensive under the conditions of Russian air superiority, which is a theoretically impossible task according to all military theories, and yet we are just, okay, go on, be heroic, defy the expectations. And almost every day, Russian planes carrying missiles to attack Ukrainian cities are in the sky, but Ukrainians are not allowed to target them with Western systems to protect themselves because they don't cross the border, and so they are kind of beyond, they're on the Russian territory. And so, yeah, while we are sleeping, we are bombing Kharkiv. While we are sleeping, we fail to defend Ukraine. And finally, the problem is that the situation is unfolding and evolving and creating new and new turns and moral dilemmas. So the moral obligation of sense-making and seeing clearly from the new story of value, it has not been exhausted in those 4 weeks, and yet we remain silent. We have withdrawn our attention, see Tom's intention to pay it again. And so the question is, are we really helping Ukraine in any way we can? Now, as I said, this moral equivalence story that Marc criticized actually gained more strength in the process because of the shift to the institutional response. And it arises from perceiving all hierarchies as dominance hierarchies. Everyone is equally bad, or as Marc called it, from the tragic stage of consciousness, which emerges in opposition to pre-tragic us versus them stance, and basically perceives any post-tragic narrative, so discerning moral distinctions as pre-tragic us versus them, especially if us actually happen to be morally preferable. And indeed, there is truth in that. We must always be wary of unjustifiably seeing us as in any way better than them. And in this case, seeing NATO or the US as holders and defenders of values more superior to, say, Russia. And we should be more willing to look into our own dark shadows than in those of other cultures. That's why Marc, in my opinion, was like way too willing to see the spark of light in Putin and Russia, but we were able to compensate for that in our book using my own, permission to be as dark about Russia as I wish. But even though this position, the moral equivalence position, is linked to postmodernism, and therefore to the idea that all values are basically social constructs. But this position right now does have this certain air of moral superiority over those who allow themselves to see that, for all their faults, in the current context, NATO and the US are defending morally superior values. And because of this air of moral superiority, these stories kind of came to assume the role of missing value-based narrative. And this creates the confusion, which is actually dangerous because this corrupts our inner moral compass and influences our moment-to-moment decisions. Like today, should I actually write to Biden and demand fighter jets for Ukraine? Should I send money to them, to the Ukraine military through some kind of network, or should I just, cry and concentrate on the new story of value? So what actually happened? What actually happened here? Why had the story developed in this direction and not exactly as Marc predicted? So in the beginning of this invasion, not only Marc, but nobody in the West, apart from a couple of generals, actually believed that Ukrainians can resist effectively. And therefore, as Biden was actually warning against the war, nobody even thought of helping Ukraine prepare and arm itself. Reportedly, one German minister told the Ukrainian diplomat asking for weapons that it would make no sense because Ukraine was going to cease to exist in about a week. Embassies were being evacuated from Kyiv, and when the invasion started, the only help we offered to President Zelensky was a ride, that is to airlift him out of Ukraine. Hence his famous response, "I need ammunition, not a ride." But once the Ukrainians defied expectations and surprised everyone, including all military experts and politicians, the Western leaders recognized the clear window of opportunity, especially in view of the wide and enthusiastic public support of Ukraine. So Putin's plan was actually to subjugate Ukraine quickly in a matter of weeks, if not days, and from there, victorious, to use his nuclear blackmail to push NATO away, effectively abandoning its newest members, so that he could, for example, subjugate Baltic countries as well. And it would be much, much harder for weakened NATO to defend such a tiny country as Estonia against the Russian invasion, which would be strengthened by absorption of Ukraine, than to simply help Ukraine, which was quite ready and willing to defend itself. All they asked for is our help with weapons, because their initial supply was exhausted very quickly. And as I already mentioned, in this obvious sense, Ukraine has been fighting our common battle, fulfilling the purpose for which NATO was created, to defend Europe. And yet our participation is still framed as helping Ukraine in a very limited way, without recognizing it as our war, with actually very moderate commitment. In other words, it's marred by the shadows of ethnocentric intimacy in which the lives of people from our tribe are instinctively seen as more valuable than theirs. And even though our military support has been limited, the initially very clear, morally clear response got fused with the realpolitik and therefore tarnished by all the previous mistakes of the Western alliance and the US especially. And what should be rightfully recognized as a good thing, the power of Western countries solidified in service of genuine values, instead made the overall situation more confusing for many, simply because we have good reasons not to fully trust the purity of our government's intentions. So the military support of Ukraine assumed the flavor and fragrance of the old pre-tragic us versus them distinction, because the West has finally recognized the familiar enemy, so it has this flavor of pseudo-errors. So I am actually a little bit short of time, so I kind of won't go into the details of this moral equivalence story, but I'll mention one thing, that this story, which claims that America and not Russia is to blame for this war, that Russia had legitimate security concerns, that NATO has no business to intervene, that it somehow managed to manipulate Ukrainians to sacrifice themselves in a proxy war for no good reason, that Ukrainians are right-wing nationalists or even Nazis suppressing Russians, and they have no democracy and whatnot, and that we should stop providing weapons to Ukrainians because we only fuel the war. This story, in its barely distinguishable several variants, is being propagated by several distinct groups of unlikely, strange bedfellows, as it were. Putin and his diplomats and propagandists, the likes of Tucker, the first group, the second group with the likes of Tucker Carlson and the Western fringe right-wing propaganda, and most disturbingly, by some people who are arguably at the leading edge of cognitive and spiritual evolution of the West, often people with impeccable reputation and wielding great influence. And I'm sure you encountered some of that. And it is because of them, because of their reputation, their, moral gravitas, as opposed to our government's dubious moral pedigree, that this story emerges as the only value-based response, as opposed to the realpolitik response of the Western governments. And this is murderous. This is actually murder. But one of the reasons I'm doing this right now is because Marc has actually asked me to read a book on the topic, written by someone he deeply respects and trusts because of his previous scholarship. And imagine my surprise when I found this book overflowing with Putin's propaganda talking points, a shameless distortion of basic facts, lies which have been refuted again and again and again. So his mistrust of his own government and the mainstream media was so huge that he innocently swallowed these lies wholesale and thrown the weight of his lifelong reputation behind them. And I'm not naming the names following Marc's lead because it doesn't really matter. I don't want to blame anyone. But this is still awful. And so I obviously don't have time here to refute all these facts. I will need the whole semester of lectures for that. But I just tell you that there are two good sources to actually dissolve that really quickly. The first is actually listen to what the Russian internal propaganda is saying. And there is a lady called Julia Davis who runs a YouTube channel called Russian Media Monitor, where she posts almost daily short snippets from the several Russian TV shows with English subtitles. And so depending on your tolerance for genocidal, homophobic, and just really crazy rhetoric, you can check it out and see how it works for the moral equivalence between the US and Russia. And Professor Timothy Snyder has a series of lectures on YouTube, which is called The Makings of a Modern Ukraine, which is another highly valuable source. And so right now, without going into further details, I want to, in lieu of prayer, I want to ask whoever is sharing the video, I ask to share it. But I'll just say a few words about what this video is about. And this will be just don't start playing it. And when you start, play it from the beginning. It is actually a song created and sung by President Zelensky, not president, and his band. And as you see, he looks like about a century younger than he is. This is a Ukrainian prayer for Ukraine, but they sing in Russian, by the way. There is only one Ukrainian word in this whole text.
Над Брюсселем туман, в Вашингтоне мороз, южный берег не наш, на востоке беда. Им там кто-то внушил, что без нас хорошо. Но кто здесь станет первым, кто сможет сказать: мы идем не туда. Ты в свои 25 обжигалась не раз. Каждый новый свой путь почему-то связав
с тем, кто в клятве тебе
и на книге святой продолжает врать, глядя в твои поднебесного цвета глаза. Держи меня, Родина, тем, что не продано, тем, что мне свято и что близко сроду мне. От моей слабости, жадности, глупости, Родина, просто меня удержи. Мы сами свой путь устелили пожарами, свистом булыжника, рваными ранами. Выбрали сами себе то, что моего. Родина, Ненька,
не зря ведь, скажи.
Смыли кровь с мостовой, заметая следы, позолота гербов превращается в пыль.
Снова врут в новостях, снова бьют нам под дых.
Сделав из украинской мечты так легко сувенир для толпы. Ты в свои 25 удивляла не раз, побеждая порой всем чертям вопреки.
Становилась мудрей,
понимая, кто враг, ощущая на горле стальные тиски вороватой руки. держи меня, Родина, духом, что бродит нас, тем, что с тобой уже вместе пройдено. Горькою памятью, голосом совести, голосом крови меня удержи. Крепко держи меня, Родина, милая, я не хочу неоплаченной милости, я не прошу унизительной жалости, не отпускай, мое сердце держи. Держись, моя Родина, только, пожалуйста, я не боюсь, не сдаюсь и не жалуюсь. Я заслоню тебя сердцем отчаянным, падая и поднимаясь, любя. Только держись, моя Родина смелая, верь мне словам, а тому, что я делаю, будет свободным твое поколение, только свободною зная тебя.
Спасибо большое!
So yeah, was a prayer for Ukraine, and in the end, which we cut out, Zelensky says thank you in Russian and then in Ukrainian. And I invite you to join this prayer and now maybe share in the chat your experiences. And I invite you to pay attention, because it is our attention. It is our like moment-to-moment attention, our moment-to-moment realization of what's really happening, our moment-to-moment discernment and unlaziness of attention that can help save Ukraine and save ourselves.